Tonight. My name is Steve Cammarano. I'm the college's Associate Vice President for Public Affairs, and it's my happy job to welcome you to the college tonight. Before we begin, just a few housekeeping items. There are exits on both sides of the room as well as in the rear in the event of an emergency. If anyone needs to use restrooms, they are out the back door and down the corridor to the right of the glass room there, just across from the glass room, both a men's room and a women's room. I'd like to thank Rhode Island Public Radio and all of their staff for their help and support in putting this event together. I'd like to thank Father Shanley and the college administration, as well as the departments that helped us co-sponsor this event, our political science department and our Office of Academic Affairs. At this time, I'd like to introduce to you the General Manager of Rhode Island Public Radio, Mr. Torrey Malatia.
Thank you very much, Cammarano. Thanks for coming this evening. We hope you find it of value. And I just wanted to let you all know that we are taping this conversation tonight, and we will be airing it tomorrow night on Rhode Island Public Radio, your place for public service journalism here in Rhode Island. You can listen to it on 88.1 FM, 89.3 FM, 91.5 FM, and 102.7 FM. Again, that'll be tomorrow evening at 8 p.m. So thank you very much for coming tonight, and it's my pleasure to introduce Rhode Island Public Radio's political reporter, Ian Donnis, who will introduce the panel. Thanks.
Thank you, Torrey. And just a couple of basics before we begin our discussion. If you have a mobile device, please silence it or turn it off. And please refrain from interjecting into our discussion, because that'll only take time away from what we're here to discuss. We will have a Q&A period after the discussion, so we'll be happy to entertain your questions afterwards. And thanks very much for being here. We really appreciate it. So it's safe to say there's never been a president like Donald Trump. He took office with no previous military or political experience. He won the presidency on a razor-thin margin of 80,000 votes in Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, and Michigan. President Trump has outraged many Americans on an ongoing basis. Special Counsel Robert Mueller is probing possible ties between Russia and Trump's campaign, and Trump's approval ratings are the lowest ever for a president's first year in office. But many conservatives applaud Trump, and he's retained support among the base of Republicans that helped elect him. So what lies ahead for the Trump presidency, and what does his first year in office tell us? That's the focus for a discussion this evening at the Slavin Center at Providence College. This event is co-sponsored by PC's Department of Political Science and the Office of Academic Affairs. I'm Rhode Island Public Radio political reporter Ian Donnis, and I'd like to start by introducing our panel. From the far right, Devin Driscoll is a proud alum of Providence College, currently a law student at the University of Minnesota Law School, and he's certainly no stranger to Rhode Island. He led President Obama's Rhode Island campaign in 2008 and also managed Clay Pell's 2014 campaign for governor. Next to him is State Republican Chairman Brandon Bell, a founding partner of the law firm of Fontaine Bell, which handles general civil litigation, criminal litigation, and domestic relations, and certainly an active participant in Rhode Island's political thrust and parry. Next up here is Gabriela Dolmens, director of the Latino Policy Institute at Roger Williams University. She served as deputy campaign manager for Maryland Governor Martin O'Malley's Democratic presidential campaign in 2016 and has often commented in the media. On my left is Lisa Pelosi. presently the Vice President for Communications and Government Relations at Johnson & Wales University. We should note she is expressing her own views tonight. She was also Communications Director for former Rhode Island Governor Lincoln Almond, and also worked for the U.S. House and U.S. Senate in Washington. And last but not least, Providence College political science professor Joseph Cammarano. His areas of expertise include the presidency, Congress, public management, and campaigns and elections. So thank you all to members of the panel for being here tonight. I'd like to start with one signature of the Trump White House. That's the frequency of President Trump's bombastic statements, many of them on Twitter. It seems like President Trump's approval rating might go up by 10, who knows, maybe 15 points if he just laid off the Twitter for a little bit, but instead he really can't seem to separate himself from continually making controversial statements. Brandon Bell, is President Trump his own worst enemy?
I don't think he should stop tweeting, if that's what you're asking, and I don't think he's his own worst enemy. Part of the appeal of President Trump is his authenticity. He's a straight shooter. That's what got him elected. And I think that the fact that he continues to tweet, am I a fan of many of his tweets? No. I would prefer that they be toned down. Is it presidential? Probably not. But we've seen that from generation to generation, the way chief executives have changed. And, for example, Ronald Reagan in 1980, after a horrible decade of the 70s, you came up with Ronald Reagan, and there was all kinds of criticism of the way he responded. And now, after 8 years of President Obama and the disaster that he was, we elected President Trump.
Gabriela Dolmens, it looks like you're itching to get in here. Certainly, many of President Trump's supporters like the way that he is the polar opposite of most politicians who speak in a plastic political language. But what do you make of his inability to stop getting embroiled in controversy?
I bristled on two counts. One of them is having Ronald Reagan and Donald Trump in the same even sentence. These two leaders present completely different visions of the Republican Party. And the second one is our president is a bully, and he doesn't seem to understand that words have consequences. When he goes down an escalator and says Mexicans, like me, are murderers and rapists, a man in Boston gets kicked in a horrendous hate crime with people saying, "Get out of my country." Words have consequences, leadership has consequences. And in fact, today, there was a quote from The Hill about Tillerson and about how he has his staff print out Donald Trump's tweets to figure out how to create policy off of that. How do you create policy off of bombastic, insulting, pejorative, and racist language? Fortunately, though, one thing that has been good is that his tweets have been used in court to stop some of his most egregious offenses, right? Because they prove malicious intent, they prove racism, et cetera. So they're his own worst enemy, and in some way, the resistance, big defense.
Lisa Pelosi, you're a Republican, but it's my sense that you're not a huge fan of President Trump. So let's get your perspective on his mode of communication and how it works or does not work for the president and his agenda.
Well, to start, first, I agree with you. What every politician has to learn is the power of their words. What we have with Donald Trump is he became president without going through what many previous presidents have gone through. They're governors, they're U.S. senators, they've been in the military. They've had to gone through their career to learn how to measure and moderate what they say, because of what they say does have the power. It has the power to move markets. It could have the power to start a nuclear war. So that's something that Donald Trump has had to learn. But on the other hand, Donald Trump has used Twitter because it's unfiltered. he can get his message out and not rely on the traditional mainstream media to take what his words are and then to refashion them. So this has been Donald Trump from the beginning, that unfiltered, here I am, here are my thoughts, I am going to start every single morning and let you know exactly what I'm thinking, and that's what he's been doing.
Providence College professor Joe Cammarano, you're a student of politics and the presidency. What is your analysis of how President Trump's communication style is a liability and or an advantage for him?
Well, on the one hand, he's not all that different in some ways, because if we look at the presidency in the modern period, the direct communication with the American public began with FDR, and every president since FDR has found a different way to innovate, to adapt to the technology that already exists, to create another unmediated link. I think that's, so in some ways he's just exploiting technology the way it is now, just like other presidents have done. The difference, I think, is this impulsivity problem, that I do think that Donald Trump, through learning, through his career, figured be bombastic, make a big splash, don't worry about the consequences. There's no such thing as bad attention. And I think that worked, and that's how he's behaving, but that's not how presidents have to behave, and I think that's what the problem is.
Devin Driscoll, President Trump, his bombast aside, he is pleasing some conservatives. The Republicans passed a major tax initiative, and we can debate whether that was good or bad. He's appointed a number of conservative judges. He's undoing a number of Obama-era regulations. Is this a foundation for building support among Republicans and conservative-leaning independents?
Well, I certainly think, Ian, that it is a way of earning the support and fealty of congressional Republicans at a minimum. In particular, if you look at his work on judges, the initial sort of original sin of his presidency is the Supreme Court and Justice Gorsuch, and the rate at which particularly courts of appeal, but also district court judgeships are being filled with folks at the Federalist Society is happily mailing in. I think that is making a lot of congressional Republicans very happy. The rollback of a lot of regulatory reforms that were enacted under the Obama administration, particularly in areas that I care about in energy and the environment, are making a lot of folks in coal country very happy, even if it isn't bringing back the jobs that don't really exist anymore. As to whether that works for conservative-leaning independents, that's the question that we're seeing played out in some special elections over the end of 2017, and I think really where the contest is going to be over the next year in 2018. People get themselves in trouble by thinking of permanent majorities in elections. Elections are snapshots, and the snapshot in 2016 is not one that a lot of Democratic and Democratic-leaning independents like. I'm not certain that the snapshot in 2018 is going to be what the president and congressional Republicans want to see either.
Gabriela Dolmens, we heard a little bit earlier about your offense at President Trump, but what about his conservative accomplishments? Is he putting together a foundation for building support for his political program?
You know, I think I have a lot of, it sounds funny to say, but I have a lot of Republican friends, and I think most of them were really, really offended by President Trump and his campaign. I think, is he building support for his conservative base, or is it being accepted by his conservative base? Yes, we know that he tweets and he says these things because he says, oh, my base loves it. It's like red meat, right? Just like that video that he said, the video before he was elected where he said, if I ever run, I'm going to run as a Republican because they'll believe anything that I say, right? He has this weird, disrespect towards his base that they seem to love. Maybe it's this natural way of speaking. Maybe it's, he's voicing frustrations in a way that I personally find offensive, but that other people are feeling relieved that they're actually expressing it. What he's actually doing is what's also really, really dangerous.
Brandon Bell, it looks like you're simmering there. Let's get a response from your perspective as state Republican chairman about the kind of policy efforts that President Trump is putting forward and what significance they hold moving forward.
Well, I think putting Gabrielle and I next to each other might have been a mistake, but having said that, I completely disagree with her that conservatives are very upset with President Trump. Your taxes are lower, the regulations are decreasing, we have peace and prosperity, ISIS is in retreat.
peace and
You are not unhappy. I didn't say here at home in your living room, Gabriela. I'm talking about in general. There is peace and prosperity. And so, but going on something that the professor said earlier is, generation to generation, the presidencies have changed. And, I just pulled this editorial from the Providence Journal, and it says something to this. It says, his whole career has shown that the ordinary rules of the political game do not apply to him. Episodes that would come near ruining any other man have only made him stronger. His supporters do not care for his lapses from taste or his violence of speech and action. They like him the better for such demonstrations that he is one of them. This editorial is not the latest Ed Acorn piece on Donald Trump. This is from October of 1910 about Theodore Roosevelt. So, various presidents, and we can go through them, but we don't have time tonight, it's the culture and where they are in society. And I appreciate what Joe said about the fact that they didn't have technology in 1910 or in 1980 for that matter. But policy-wise, he's overperforming when it comes to the economy. Overperforming. The economy is booming right now. It's booming. It's trickling down right here in Rhode Island, where you see benefits from this tax reform, which the Democrats have just done a horrible job in branding, against themselves, because it's 90% of the people will benefit from tax relief. Not only are the folks that are working, the middle class, but the businesses that they work for are benefiting, and they're giving back to their workers. So I don't see how that's a bad thing. So policy-wise, I think he's doing a really good job. His means to the ends, he's a street fighter. He's a street fighter. He's a guy from Queens who's on a construction site, and he says what's on his mind. And is it presidential? Do I wish he took shithole back? Yes.
Republican analyst Lisa Pelosi, let me ask you about the Republican tax proposal. The Democrats say it's mostly going to benefit the rich, and so far it has not been popular, but it might prove more popular moving forward as some people find a little more money in their paychecks. Is this good policy from your perspective?
Well, I think the more people are learning about tax reform, about the bill that got passed, more people are starting to like it. So there have been recent polls that show, of course, Republicans really like it, and the Democrats are not there yet with us. So we have to wait to see how it actually trickles down. But you're right, Brandon. Most of the people will see a tax cut. It'll come in a little while, but they will start seeing money in their pockets, and they'll start seeing the benefits of this tax reform going forward. So it was good policy. What's very important to remember is Donald Trump ran on a number of issues. And when you talk about his base, the reason why his base is behind him is because the issues that he ran on in 2016 are the issues that he's been working on in 2017 and 2018. He made promises, and he's moving forward to keep those promises. So that's why that core base support of Donald Trump are still with him.
Providence College professor Joe Cammarano, how do you think the GOP tax plan will affect President Trump moving forward? Help or hurt?
We like to look at the longer-term picture. I'm not a trained economist, but I do know enough about macroeconomics to know that any effect of any kind of tax reform is marginal at best any time, and more dependent on forces that are way beyond government's control. Total government spending is a fraction of our GDP. So there's really not that much. There could be a lot of talk of it, and there's pocketbook voting. If you put a few bucks in someone's pocket, they may think it's better. I do think that the tax reform at this point in time is probably a wash. It may improve the electoral prospects of the Republican Party this year if some of the tax benefits accrue the way everybody hopes they will on the Republican side. I don't think tax reform is going to have much impact on Trump, in part because of Donald Trump.
Brandon Bell, I'd like to follow up on something you mentioned, the blank hole controversy, for lack of a better description. Obviously, that got a lot of attention. Democrats are very offended. President Trump denies that he's a racist, but he has sounded a lot of what Democrats say are dog whistles, appealing to the baser nature of people who are hateful. What is your explanation for why President Trump has not more forcefully repudiated the hate groups who perceive him as showing some solidarity?
Look, I'll just throw it right out there. He's made some real mistakes, and the S-hole, sorry for saying shit earlier. Oh, I just had to that was really, that was a mistake. It was a real mistake. Everything that happened in Charlottesville, and believe me, I said it at the time. I'm not saying it now, 6 months, 8 months later. I said it about, initially when he was campaigning about the Muslim ban. I think it's un-American the way he proposed it. I think the way it ended up happening is quite different. I think the Roy Moore stuff was just I'm totally against it. I repudiated that. I don't think that Donald Trump is a racist. You can disagree with me. I know you disagree with me, but you could disagree with me, and that's okay. I don't dislike you for disagreeing with me if you do. I don't think he's racist. I think he's a street fighter. He says stupid things sometimes. I thought about Jesse Jackson talking about Hymietown. I thought about Phil Noel locally, a Democrat, talking about the ghetto, the ghetto town. I don't think of them as anti-Semitic and racist just because they said those words. So I think he made errors. He has not lived his life as a racist. His daughter converted to Judaism. His son-in-law is a practicing Jew. I don't see that. That's not the way racists comport themselves. David Duke would not be seen with a Jew. But Donald Trump has absolutely no problem. He has not comported himself as a racist. I understand that some of these things are very inflammatory and bombastic, and I would like him not to say them.
You're listening to a public forum being recorded before a live audience at the Slavin Center at Providence College. I'm Rhode Island Public Radio political reporter Ian Donnis, joined by Providence College political science professor Joe Cammarano, Republican analyst Lisa Pelosi, Gabriela Dolmens of the Latino Policy Institute at Roger Williams University, Rhode Island Republican Chairman Brandon Bell, and PC alum and Democratic political operative Devin Driscoll. Devin Driscoll, you're a law student, so I'm curious on your perspective on Special Counsel Robert Mueller's investigation of President Trump and possible links to Russia. President Trump says this is a fishing expedition. Where do you see this headed, and what are the stakes?
Well, where it's heading is beyond my pay grade or anyone in the room. Robert Mueller is a consummate professional in law enforcement, and I have every confidence in his ability to do this investigation fairly and fully. What I think is troubling are questions around the president and decision-making, both by those in his campaign's employ and himself, ultimately himself, the buck stops there. And as we see more indictments coming out over the coming months, questions of relationships with Russia or other international actors are things that I think we need to be aware of. And it's easy for this to sound like a boogeyman, right? Russia is a historical antagonist, and so it's easy to sort of put, in 2012 we were laughing about Russia as an antagonist, international antagonist. So I understand that that can be troubling, but the level of engagement on questions of American elections from Russian agents, I think is really troubling when you get down in the weeds and think about these conversations people are having. And so I'm hopeful that this doesn't drag on too long, but I want it to drag on long enough to get the fair and full analysis of what happened.
Lisa Pelosi, we can remember when Ronald Reagan had a very successful campaign ad back in the 80s, the bear in the woods. The Soviet Union was considered a threat. But now there's a very partisan view of Russia, and it's only Democrats who are more concerned about potential links between the Trump campaign and Russia. What is your view of the Mueller probe and the efforts by some Republicans to challenge the credibility of Mueller?
I think there's really been a bit of a dark cloud over the Trump presidency since even before it began. You know, it was even in that transition time after the election that dark cloud has been following. The president seems to be distracted by it. Every once in a while, he's tweeting out about it because something happens in the news. So he gets distracted, and then he only adds to it. I think that's what you mentioned, but some of the things that he said that could be used, perhaps against it. when these investigations go on this long, you almost want them just to be over. And you know that the people involved in it know what happened or what didn't happen. So it's best for the country that that Mueller does his work, he concludes this as quickly as he can, and then whatever the ramifications from it happen.
Providence College professor Joe Cammarano, why doesn't President Trump simply say that, there is ample evidence that Russia did meddle in the election, the precise impact we don't know, but why doesn't he call that out?
Well, this is an example where the political science, which I thought may not be relevant anymore because of the election of Trump, really does instruct us that what you have to do is you have to understand who Donald Trump is, what his first sort of successes were, how he got along in business, what worked, what didn't, to see the patterns of behavior. And so all we're seeing is a repeat of the past 50 years of Donald Trump's life. And he's not going to change. One of those patterns in his character, and I grew up in the New York area, so I've known him since he was in the news for the first years in New York. I think what you're seeing is this is somebody who really has a difficult time admitting he's wrong. And he will never do that. He will never say, I am wrong. And the problem with that is when you make bombastic statements and you're a president, you're going to have to do that at some point in time. So whatever the reason, I think he's hurting himself, not just on Russia, but on everything, by making these claims and then us seeing they're obviously incorrect.
Gabriela Dolmens, quick comment on the same question. What is your perspective on the Mueller probe and why the president has not called out Russia?
I think it says a lot more about the Mueller probe that Donald Trump and Fox News are trying to vilify Mueller. I think that's the answer that we have. Why would he want to vilify Mueller if he didn't have something to hide? I agree. I want this to be over. But I don't think that we should cease to be shocked by the fact that Russia interfered in an American election and that the current sitting president is trying to stop this investigation from going to find out the truth.
So could I add in on that? The thing that really bothers me.
Joe Cammarano?
What really bothers me about this isn't Donald Trump's response, isn't Donald Trump's behavior, not even Fox News' behavior. It's the behavior of Americans who are refusing to even entertain the idea that somebody interfered with the most sacred aspect of a democracy, and that's an election.
Yep.
Why not? Why aren't more Americans outraged about that?
Well, I think we're in a period of polarization, and that we've gotten to the point where we have forgotten. I just went to a Bernice King's talk, Martin Luther King's daughter, and she said, look, we have to stop dismissing the other side. The problem is we've forgotten that, and we're in an era where competition is all that matters, winning is all that matters, and as a result, we cannot acknowledge the fault within ourselves.
We can't talk about President Trump without mentioning fake news, but Brandon Bell, some people think it's a little bit hypocritical when President Trump cries fake news because he did popularize the false claim that President Obama was not born in the U.S. Give us your take on that. And, do you think that, as many Trump supporters believe, that the media is out to get President Trump?
I think it's factual that the media is trying to get President Trump. I mean,
but
I think that's...
isn't it? I mean, I think the Washington Post and New York Times are doing a lot of valid reporting on legitimate stories, are they not?
I do agree with that. And I think that, look, he gets very defensive, clearly. If he's attacked, he attacks back. That's the street fighting thing that I was talking about earlier. And that's not immune to people in his own party. Corker, Graham. Look at the people he's had fights with and then made up with and he's fine with suddenly. And I think at the end of the day, look, the First Amendment, as a lawyer who, particularly 25 years ago when I was in law school, really appreciated constitutional law and grasped it really well. The First Amendment is crucial, in society. It doesn't just give freedom of the press. But it also doesn't immunize them from criticism. And I think that the press deserves to be criticized for this entire election cycle.
Well, be specific. Where in particular do you see the media falling down in your view?
I mean, let's just take yesterday, for example, after the president's physical exam. When has anyone ever seen a president's doctor, even if the president put him out in front of the press room, in the Brady room there, to answer questions, ask questions for 49 minutes about everything from, propecia to, cognitive abilities, and now you have news organizations today saying, doctors from news organizations saying that, oh yeah, no, he's got heart disease. That doctor might not have said it, but he's got heart disease. The only time in history that I could think of that a president's health was under so much scrutiny when there really was no issue was when there was an issue. And again, I'll use President Reagan. He was shot. So of course people wanted to know what happened after he was shot and what impact that had. So I think that that press conference, there was a cartoon today. I don't know if you tweeted it out. I saw it. It was hysterical. It's the doctor up on the stage saying the president's in excellent health, and you see all these press folks who we all know because we see them every day in that room, and they're like, oh no, oh my God. Like really? He's in good health? He's okay? And so that's really just one example of many, but it's the scrutiny that just goes to a different level. And also, I'll just leave it at this other point here, and that's maybe bringing family members into the fold is not the greatest idea in the world. However you think of that, although I think that Ivanka Trump brings a lot to the table, I think that others in his family bring a lot to the table, but he gets offended when his family members are attacked. And I would too. If my family members were attacked, I'm never going to be president, but I just wanted to say that.
Gabriela Dolmens, we hear Republican Chairman Brandon Bell subscribing to this view that the media is out to get President Trump, but Trump got so much free publicity during the presidential race from the major cable networks. He's arguably a creation of the media. He got obsessive coverage in the New York tabloids back in the day. So has the media done as much to build President Trump up as to criticize him?
Absolutely. I mean, as I worked for, as you mentioned at the beginning, I was a deputy campaign manager for Governor Martin O'Malley. And, there's certain rules in the media, right? So, for example, Morning Joe, right? You can't call in to Morning Joe. You have to be there to be on Morning Joe. Highest rated show, et cetera, et cetera. Every time the president, the now president, candidate Trump would pick up the phone, they would put it on speaker, right? Every time the president had a rally, they would go. And the other thing is, look, I was a journalist, I think once, always a journalist. I think that what you're seeing in the press briefings, these folks, as you know, White House correspondents spend 24 hours a day with these people as sources and as not sources. The frustration that you're feeling is two ways. You don't, as an American president, say, you out and kick reporters out. You don't vilify CNN. You don't tweet pictures of, CNN bloody on your shoe. Even Jeff Flake, who I know might not be your favorite if you're very conservative, but even Jeff Flake is calling him out on this. It reminds me of Mexico, right? In Mexico, the political parties control the press. That is what Donald Trump would like to do. And the other thing is, the challenges that you're seeing from the press is because the president doesn't say the truth and uses cabinet secretaries and institutions of government that we pay for to propagate lies. 2 days ago, when the new Department of Homeland Security secretary was being interviewed by the Senate, the Department of Homeland Security releases a report saying immigrants create more crimes than any other person. In fact, 3 out of 4 domestic terrorism, 3 out of 4 terrorist acts that happen in the United States come from immigrants. When they well knew that the majority of those were people that had been extradited from other countries in order to inflate the numbers. You have to be skeptical. And as a journalist who's disrespected, who is, bullied by this president, I understand the animosity. And I respect the fact that they're still showing up, given that this president doesn't respect the Fourth Estate, doesn't appreciate being criticized, even if it's their job. I respect the job that they're doing tremendously.
Republican analyst Lisa Pelosi, some people from various sides of the partisan aisle think President is deliberately sowing distraction to take attention away from other things. Do you agree with that theory? Why or why not?
I think that's been his MO since the beginning, that when a story's not going his way, then he comes up. We saw that during the campaign. One day it's this issue, and then the next day it's another issue, and he just keeps moving along, and then the media is trying to, keep up with him. But, what you just said, it gave me a couple of thoughts. First of all, this is not the first president who's used cabinet secretaries to go out and say the untruth. We know with Bill Clinton that he swore that he did not have sex with that woman, that all his cabinet folks went out there and they defended him on and on and on till finally the truth came out, and then all of a sudden that they felt betrayed.
I'm glad you're accepting that he's saying untruths, though, because that's a big deal.
Okay. So I just, so the balance here, and I didn't want to be put in a position of defending President Trump tonight. I was leaving that up to Brent. But I feel like it's, a little bit of a tilt going on, so I did want to do that. As far as I didn't have an opportunity to really weigh in on the media part of it, and that's been something that I've been watching very carefully as a communications person over the campaign. There was a distinct bias against Trump as time went on, and you could see it in the way the reporters would report, and that would come from their how they set up their story, the facial expressions that they used, their nonverbals that they would use, to the point that after the election, and I'd be watching CBS Network News, and I'm going to call out a couple reporters, that I stopped watching Scott Pelley and Major Garrett because their bias of setting up the stories and presenting it was so extreme that I couldn't watch it anymore. I watch national news because I'm looking for an objective presentation of the news, and here's a major network doing it. So I just wanted to weigh in on that.
Devin Driscoll, you've been a Democratic political operative. What do you think about what Lisa Pelosi said? Has there been a slant against Trump in the media?
I think President Trump is very adept at playing people's perceptions of the media to his benefit. And if there has been a shift, first of all, I absolutely accept the premise that President Trump is a creation of the media in the first instance, and that his response now to use them as a foil has been extraordinary. Because if there is a visual slant, if Major Garrett is scowling when he's reporting the news, it's because the news is scowl-inducing. It's because the behavior is such. I really trust a lot of these national and local news folks, because they will. The story they're telling, the bias that comes through is the frustration that they feel when an elected leader of the United States is willing to tell easily dismissed falsehoods. When Sean Spicer is getting up at the podium and having to lie day in, day out about crowd size because the president's ordering him to, it's easy for folks, I think, who want to be telling the story of our business, our politics, to get frustrated and distracted by that sort of nonsense. Fake news ultimately isn't about the news. It's a dog whistle to people to say, you could ignore whatever inconvenient facts are being presented here. It's not ultimately about truth or distance. It's about saying, you might have heard that that this has happened. Don't worry, that's fake news. You can just ignore the factual predicate underneath the story because it's unhelpful to the message we're trying to send. That's ultimately what fake news is. It's not about the content. It's about saying, just ignore this entirely and stay on message for us.
PC professor Joe Cammarano, we remember back in the late 90s, a lot of people scoffed when Hillary Clinton talked about a vast right-wing conspiracy. But since then, we've come along with the internet, some dark places there, some very right-wing sites like Breitbart, obviously led previously by Steve Bannon. What role has that kind of media played in the Trump world?
Well, I think both sides, the right and the left, have media outlets that are disaggregated, and they have become, which we talk about now, these sort of small echo chambers that we're all sort of trapped in, where we only talk to and hear from people who have the same viewpoint we do. So yes, there is, I wouldn't call it a vast right-wing conspiracy. I would call it the interest group universe in the United States, where they're kicking the left's butts when they win, and the left is kicking their butts when they lose. This is the natural part of the equilibrium that we're supposed to see. The big difference, I think, is in the 20th century, we had this sort of period of stability where objective journalism was the premier value of virtually all the media, and there were only a handful of media at the time. That, of course, is broken down. Politics has become a business now for the media. They used to lose money on the news. They now make money on the news. And so their economic imperative drives all of this. My advice to you is to stop watching network news and start listening to public radio. I'm not doing that just because
I didn't tell him to say
and
that.
to read, and stop wasting your time with the networks, and stop wasting your time with.
But isn't that one of the great ironies of this age, that there's so much useful information that can be found, but not many people avail themselves of it?
So
Gabriela Dolmens.
This is, it was really interesting. I was working to prepare for this, and I was looking at, year in review kind of stuff. And Amy Cola, who's here in the audience, helped me with USA Today, right? So less than 3% of the population reads the New York Times. We might be some of them, and that's amazing, but that's not what people read, right? USA Today is one of the most read newspapers. So we're sitting here, and these are the really, really important things that we should be discussing. The top 3 stories read last year by most Americans. 1, a commercial about a kiss cam was the top read story from USA Today. 2, is it all over for coconut oil? Yes and no. And 3, a teenage girl who shot an elk in Missouri. So it's really crazy, right? Social media is leading to us being able to pick and choose. Obviously, most people get their news from Facebook, from Twitter. It's creating these silos in which, what you said, right? People aren't talking to each other.
And that brings me to the point of think about the old days. Politicians wouldn't pick their fights because you're.
This is Brandon Bell, state Republican chairman.
Buddy Cianci said it locally. You don't fight with someone who buys ink by the barrel. But now, so what? I'll just avoid them, and I'll go on Twitter and say what I have to say. It doesn't make a difference. You can actually pick that fight, and I have a really good relationship with NPR and the local press here and the political folks here, and I like that. He doesn't care. It doesn't matter to him. And I didn't get to comment on the creation of the media. Hey, he had $2 billion the last time I sat on a panel during the beginning of the primary. $2 billion in earned media. And that was in January of 16 before the first primary or caucus.
All right, coming up, we're going to talk about what's ahead. You're listening to a live public forum at the Slavin Center at Providence College. I'm Rhode Island Public Radio political reporter Ian Donnis, joined by Democratic operative Devin Driscoll, Rhode Island Republican Chairman Brandon Bell, Gabriela Dolmens of the Latino Policy Institute at Roger Williams University, Republican analyst Lisa Pelosi, and Providence College political science professor Joe Cammarano. Now, President Trump's low approval ratings have given hope to many Democrats about the upcoming midterm elections. Hopes are high for a wave election, with Democrats regaining one or possibly both chambers of Congress, despite a somewhat challenging landscape in the Senate. Joe Cammarano, what do you expect? And are Democrats being a little too optimistic at this stage?
Well, I think everybody's being too optimistic and too pessimistic right now. Look, the reality is off-year elections. There's usually a decline in support for the president's party. On the aggregate level, the best predictor of the vote is presidential popularity and the economy. And so those are counter force trends right now. His popularity is down, the economy is doing well, it has been doing well for a while. And so usually the president will lose seats. We have to remember Trump didn't win many seats in the House. I don't know if he won seats in the House. He may have lost a couple. And I think he lost a couple in the Senate as well, or one in the Senate last time around. So there was no surge. And so the decline is likely to be a steeper decline than we might normally see. Will it be like 2010? I'm not so sure yet.
Lisa Pelosi, how do you see the outlook for the midterm elections?
I think it's still a little too early to call it right now because things are rapidly changing. But to go back to the year in review and we look at what Trump has been able to accomplish, he has been able to accomplish a few of the things that he wants to do. Trying to figure out in the next few months what's going to happen. Will we go to war with North Korea? Will something catastrophic, will there be terrorism on our shores? We don't know what could happen. You're right, traditionally in an off year, the opposite party is energized. They want to come out. So the voters who feel that they really want to make change, they'll come out. A lot of the seats that are being defended in areas where Trump won. So we have that. What kind of quality candidates will the Republicans bring forward? In that same case, what quality Democrats will bring forward? I still think it's too early. There's so much more that has to happen before we're really going to get a full sense of what next year will, November will be.
Gabriela Dolmens, what's in your crystal ball?
I think it depends a lot on the political parties, on the Democratic Party, actually. I was President Obama's spokesperson in 2012 and designed his Latino vote strategy. And as you know, we increased Latino voter turnout and arguably got him the presidency. But since then, the kind of work that we did to reach disaffected voters, minority voters, African Americans, immigrants, Latinos, has dropped. I mean, the fact that Hillary Clinton, in a Trump election, didn't raise the Latino vote is significant of that. So I'm hopeful. What we're seeing in the Senate right now is Democrats finally leaning in to what defines us as a country, which is immigration, by saying that they're willing to shut down the government over this DACA fight. That's something that folks that have been fighting for human and immigrant rights like me for such a long time have been wanting to see the Democratic Party do. But it depends about on the ground. I mean, Devin can tell you, if you don't knock those doors, if you don't remind those people and put the money into that, people aren't going to turn out.
Brandon Bell, are you worried Democrats are going to retake the House?
That's always a concern for the first midterm. 2010 was a huge example of that. What Lisa said, 25 out of, specifically 25 out of 33 of the Senate seats that are up, are Republicans defending. I know there's a couple people who are retiring. 10 Trump states, overwhelming Trump states, such as West Virginia, where he won by 30 or 40 points probably. So I think that you don't know. It's too early. I don't know that the Democrats are organized. I actually agree with Gabriela on that. I don't know that they're organized. I think that maybe there's a little bit more organization on this fight about the government shutdown, but I'm not so sure that they're organized. And money-wise, what I could tell you that's public is that the Republican National Committee is in no debt and has a ton of money cash on hand, like as in probably $50 million cash on hand, whereas the Democrats have $6 million cash on hand with a lot of debt. I'm not really sure if this resistance is working if they're not raising money. I could say a lot about the resistance and the organization or lack thereof, but I'm not so sure from the first Women's March on January 21st to almost 1 year to the day later that we're seeing any real organization within that community.
Devin Driscoll, have Democrats learned their lesson from 2016?
Well, I hope that the other Republican chairmen share your being unsure about whether they're engaged or not, because they're going to find out in November that they are. I was speaking with Secretary of State Nellie Gorbea today, and something she said to me was an articulation of something I've been looking for, which is I feel like the resistance is now morphing into the watchword no longer is resist, but engage. And we're seeing it in Minnesota, where I live. We're seeing it in Oregon, where my family lives. And we're seeing it here in Rhode Island and across the country of excellent candidate recruitment, which is a critical part of any wave election, is making sure that you have candidates who fit the district and who can do the work and represent people, give voice to constituent frustration. You're seeing, really engaged operatives, folks who worked in 2016, who saw their hopes dashed and who have said, this is not going to happen to me again. And I think you see a national conversation that is engaging on critical questions that people want to see in 2018. One of the mistakes we made in 2010 was not reading enough into things like the election in Massachusetts. And we sort of, Democrats said, oh, that was an aberration, it wasn't a great candidate, it was a short window. And I think Republicans do so at their peril to read into Virginia and New Jersey and some of these special elections in my neighboring Wisconsin, where districts that went overwhelmingly for the president in special elections, which usually is going to favor the party that usually does well there, actually flipping. West Virginia did go strongly for the president, but so did Alabama, and we have a Democratic senator from Alabama.
Wisconsin.
So
I would argue about the candidate we fielded, but yeah.
and so I think and candidate. So there's there certainly are factors that go into this. It is a multifaceted question, and you can't ride that feeling enough to victory. It requires work, it requires recruitment, it requires money and volunteers. And if we see if resist continues to morph into engage, I do believe that the president and the president's party are in for a rough time this coming November.
Well, despite all the controversy associated with President Trump, there is a government in Washington. There is a Supreme Court where he's already made one pick. He's got some controversial cabinet secretaries like Scott Pruitt at EPA, Betsy DeVos at Education. Providence College political science professor Joe Cammarano, what is your perspective on how the people in Trump's government will change America after 4 years?
See, this is, I think, the story most of us are missing. Trump, by nature, is a delegator. When was the last time he actually managed one of his big real estate projects? Probably over a decade ago. He hands things off to other people so that he can do what he wants to do, and that's get attention. And so what we're seeing is these cabinet-level secretaries or equivalents like Scott Pruitt at EPA have enormous discretion. And unfortunately, the presidency has evolved into this sort of unilateral action office where executive orders, executive memos, executive actions are done instead of trying to get Congress to act, because Congress increasingly isn't acting. And so your presidents are forced to do nothing or try the executive actions. And what's happening is these people are paying attention to their issue, and there's enormous change happening, enormous impact going on, and probably well beyond any legitimate claim of mandate, particularly on areas of education, the environment, and I would argue justice.
State Republican Chairman Brandon Bell, what kind of collective impact do you expect from Trump's cabinet and the kind of people he's putting into judicial robes over time?
Well, starting with the judicial robes, he's, I think, done a spectacular job in nominating people and being successful with those nominations. Of course, there were a couple hiccups there. A couple of the trial courts, with one guy who just had no experience. But Neil Gorsuch was a huge victory. It can't be understated. Neil Gorsuch could have an impact on what happened today with Gina Raimondo's proposed budget for sports betting. You're talking about conservative justices that look as though 5 of them will likely vote to allow sports betting and could close our budget deficit here in Rhode Island.
In a case brought by the Republican governor of New Jersey.
Of New Jersey, that's right. And another thing that Governor Raimondo could thank President Trump for. But what it really boils down to is, at the end of the day, I think he's surrounded himself with some really good people. You could say Scott Pruitt is controversial. Nikki Haley very well may be the President of the United States one of these days. I think she's doing a really great job at the UN, and I think there are a ton of other examples. General Kelly, as HHS Secretary and now as Chief of Staff, is spectacular. He's got great reviews. Gets along with across the aisle with folks. General Mattis, McMaster. There's some really good folks that he's surrounded himself with, and so the delegating that Joe was talking about needs to flow a little bit better, maybe, and maybe the first year was a little experimental in that, and hopefully he could do a better job at delegating to these folks.
Gabriela Dolmens, I'm going to go out on a limb, and I expect that you see things a little bit differently from State Republican Chairman Brandon Bell. What are your top concerns about what effects Trump's government will have over time?
I just wish I was as optimistic as you about this person. I really, really do. I don't want to dislike the president. It's just that everything he does and says, I find personally, and goes against completely all of the values that make this country what it is and why my parents came here. As far as your question, Republicans and President Trump are going to have a lasting impact on this country. They're extremely extremely efficient. Obviously, Mitch McConnell withheld the Supreme Court nomination that was President Obama's until after the election, so that the Republican, if he were to win, was to appoint somebody that was successful. All of the lower courts are being replaced by super, super conservative judges. I think that the country's going to be worse off for it, but as far as a success for the Republicans, absolutely.
Republican activist Lisa Pelosi, how about that? Was that a foul play when Republicans blocked Merrick Garland's nomination to the Supreme Court?
Maybe.
Yes. Yes.
Maybe. But then in the end,
it's smart for you guys. You guys know how to,
But we won.
maneuver it.
That's the whole thing. If Hillary Clinton had won, I thought that I would not say the name tonight. I'm sorry, I'm the first one to say it. But had Hillary Clinton won, things would be different. And so I think that that's, in and of itself,
Democrats have never done that to a Republican.
When Justice Scalia died, it was really no different than what happened when George W. Bush was looking to get,
his personal attorney?
No, it wasn't his personal attorney. Actually, I'm drawing a blank right now.
This is Harriet Miers?
Okay, that's State Republican Chairman Brandon Bell. And let's go back to Lisa Pelosi on the impact over time of President Trump's judicial picks and his administrators.
So let me just start off by saying, to the victor comes the spoils. So when you become president, this is what happens. You get to choose judges. You get to choose your cabinet secretaries. You get to choose your agenda for the country to go forward. And what we've seen is there's always a pendulum going on. So the pendulum of George Bush created the Barack Obama. And because of Barack Obama, we have Donald Trump. Yes, we do, because we have Senator Barack Obama, who became president, wanted to unite the country. Instead, the country was polarized. And that allowed Donald Trump to be able to come forward and become a voice for people who felt that they were being overlooked during the 8 years of President Obama. So that's why we have Donald Trump.
Democratic operative Devin Driscoll is.
I'm sorry, I just had a stroke.
Is Lisa Pelosi right that this all comes out in the wash over time?
No, she's not right. With all due respect, she's absolutely not right. There is no question that Donald Trump is a symptom of a sick society. The polarization that we feel right now, where we are unable to have conversations across dinner tables, let alone across the aisle, that is troubling, and it is a mark of something wrong that all of us have to recommit ourselves to making better. But to suggest that Barack Obama is the root cause of that sickness is so far from correct. I couldn't. I'm sorry for hemming and hawing over here, but it's too much to bear, because President Obama's presidency was marked by an intransigent Congress, a Senate Majority Leader in Mitch McConnell who vowed not to make him a one-term president. Right? You can't. How can you come together and lead the country when the opposition party, a leader in the opposition party, is saying that is their goal on day one? So, to the victor go the spoils. Absolutely. Well, the president gets to select. The president is vested with the power to select judges and others. But let me say this, Ian. But let me say this, Ian. Barack Obama was president when Justice Scalia died. Yep. And so if we're victoring and spoiling, that is why I think there are differences to be talked about here with Justice Gorsuch and then the broader changing of the courts.
Republican Chairman Brandon Bell, what do you say to Devin's comment that it was an intransigent Republican Congress that blocked a lot of President Obama's agenda?
I don't know if he said agenda or if you were just referring to the judicial, Merrick Garland and the broader agenda. And again, so President Obama should have done a better job of, getting Democrats elected. I mean, it's really that simple. 2010, okay, that was the first, midterm. I hope we don't have the same, similar in 2018 to what he faced. But in 2012, 14, and 16, I mean, that's for him to be blamed for. The Merrick Garland thing, I have my own opinion. It's way too long for this, but what I would say is that it was in the last year of his presidency that we all knew there was no way that he could do another term. He was a lame duck, and Justice Scalia tragically died. So to the victor goes the spoils. I mean, it really is that. There's no other way to really.
Let me stop you there. Professor Joe Cammarano, there was polarization under President Obama. There's polarization now. What would it take for us as a nation to move beyond it, or is this just the way it's going to be?
Well, I think what it's going to take is for us, those of us who are here, those of us who vote, those of us who are citizens and don't take our citizenship responsibly, to change that behavior. I was looking up on my smartphone the quote from Julius Caesar, Shakespeare's Julius Caesar, "The fault, dear Brutus, is not in the stars, it's in ourselves." And the reason they were able to get away with what I think was a constitutionally dubious argument about holding up the nomination has a lot to do with the way we vote.
Let me stop you there. And Gabriela Dolmens, last word on this to you. How do we as a nation move past this kind of deep political polarization?
I mean, I think for me, personally, and I know for a lot of my friends, first of all, it's sitting with the discomfort this is creating, right? When he calls immigrants from Africa or from Haiti or from El Salvador, the word that you said that I won't say, it's really, really coming to terms with the fact that we have a nativist, racist president and sitting with the discomfort of it.
But Donald Trump's not always going to be president. How does the nation move beyond this polarization that seems more constant?
Empathy, right? Empathy with your neighbor, with your friends, starting to think of people as actual people and not as enemies, and understanding where people are coming from.
All right, that's a good note to end on. We're almost out of time. Before we go, I'd like to thank some people who helped make this discussion happen. Maddie Parmenter, the technical staff, and everyone at Providence College. Rhode Island Public Radio General Manager Tori Malatia, News Director Elizabeth Harrison, Chief Engineer Aaron Reed, Operations and Productions Manager James Baumgartner, and we couldn't have done it without our all-star panel, Democratic operative and law student Devin Driscoll, Rhode Island Republican Chairman Brandon Bell, Gabriela Domenzain from the Latino Political Institute at Roger Williams University, Republican analyst Lisa Pelosi, and Providence College Professor Joe Cammarano. I'm Ian Donnis. Please give our panel a hand. Thank you. And if you have any questions, we'll be happy to try and answer them.
Thank you. First, I'd like to thank Devin here, who taught me in 2008 what campaigning was all about, and I'm very grateful for that. As to this whole forum, I have a real concern about the whole casting this president as a legitimate president and talking in terms of a pendulum. This president is besides being remarkably racist.
Sir, do you have a question?
Yes, I do.
Okay, please give us your question.
My question is, have you overlooked in this forum the fact that this president is just plain totally incompetent? That is my question.
Well, I think we've covered both views in support and against President Obama. Anyone else want to take a crack at that?
Sure, I'm more than happy to. Competent or incompetent, Donald Trump is President of the United States. And we all, including his supporters and his opponents and people in the middle, have got to understand that that will not change, and the odds of it changing are very low. And so we need to figure out whether we're going to let the Trump presidency destroy us, make things worse, or whether we're going to find a way to work through the problems that we have.
Yes.
Hi, so Sal Flight, president of the PCISI, Scalia Society. Just regarding kind of you guys had talked about mainstream media, you brought up the fact that individuals get a lot of their news from kind of online sources today, such as Twitter, Reddit, YouTube, Google, what have you. Could you comment on maybe how it's been caught by a lot of those companies, many of them located in a very liberal area, Silicon Valley? They're employing often algorithms to batten down conservative news. uplift liberal propaganda. Twitter has been caught recently shadow banning users so that it doesn't seem like they're interacting with anybody. What would you comment on that, on how more people are receiving their news from those sources instead of mainstream sources, and they're even more biased than those mainstream sources already are? And also, kind of a comment, you said the Democrats have never done anything similar to what Justice Gorsuch did. I think you might have been forgetting how FDR attempted to pack the courts.
Yeah, I'm talking about like
Well, actually, I just want to sort of correct you on that. FDR tried to, but had to do it through legislation which failed, and so he followed the rules of the legislative process in trying to do it, and he failed.
I'd be a little wary of sweeping generalizations about the ideological biases of social media, because there was a lot of fake news that was distributed by Facebook, and I think it comes back to what some of our panelists said, that it behooves citizens to get information from a variety of sources and to be skeptical about the information they receive. But certainly, you know, Twitter, you can find any number of very liberal or very conservative and moderate reporters, opinionators, and in between. And I don't think there's a monopoly by any stretch of viewpoints on that kind of platform.
But that being said, the skepticism that you express is good, right? Because the skepticism is going to make you want to check sources. Yeah. It's going to want to make you investigate further. And we should all be skeptical, because exactly of what happened in the election, because of the things that you point. I might see different articles, right, because I'm coming, but be skeptical, right? That's the point of journalism. Journalism is the fourth estate, right? There's very few journalists that are, you know, really producing stuff. In social media, obviously, it's just people's opinions. But, you know, you shouldn't just believe what you read, and you should dig into it and make sure that it's verified before you believe it and process it and make it part of what you think.
Yep. One of the challenges that I think we do face in answering the question that you had at the end of how do we solve this divide, how do we bridge this divide that this country faces, one of the significant challenges facing us is we do need some agreed upon facts, where we can, some sort of mediated place where we can read what's happening in the world, think about it as it relates to our policy preferences, and then be able to have a discussion. And while maybe it's not network news any longer, but I'd encourage you to, you know, subscribe to your local paper. I'm the rare under 35-year-old who subscribes to 2 newspapers. I think there's a great deal of value in local journalism, in investing in your local public radio station. Like, he didn't pay me for that either. Of having some sort of news space, particularly in a community, in a local community where people can come together. It can be a common source of information, and then we can have the kinds of discussions, mediated discussions of people with different policy preferences. But you have to have that center facts first approach, and we need to, if it's not network news, it has to be something that we can all, this sort of common well we can draw from to be able to have these discussions.
Let's go to another question from our audience.
All right, thank you. I'm Mike Bartels, president of the College Republicans here at Providence College. And one topic I keep hearing thrown
I didn't
around.
stack them.
Good more.
But one topic I hear thrown around up here is the idea that Trump, or the general political paralysis of our country, is a symptom of a sick nation. I've heard Obama blamed up there. I've heard Trump blamed up there. I'd like to suggest a third cause, and I'd like to see what you think of it. My fish, which lives in my dorm, there are some papers that report that fish have an attention span of about 9 seconds. It's been reported in the New York Times and in a number of other papers, such as Time Magazine, that the attention span of an average human has been reduced to 8 seconds because of social media and because of our attachment to these little things, smartphones. So I guess what I'm getting at there is that whether or not this is true, you can interpret Trump's reliance on tweets as a response to this, because if Trump writes a long statement, then nobody's going to read it. I write long statements as president of my chapter all the time. Nobody reads them. And left-wing media is doing it too. This isn't just a Trump problem. You look at Al Jazeera Plus, you look at Now This, and now they have whatever the 30th chapter they made of that is, and Independent Journal Review. So if the president tweeting is a problem, I guess, and if media resorting to this is a problem to get people's attention, which I think it is, what would you suggest to these institutions and politicians as an alternative to try and fix this issue that is plaguing our country?
Well, I think you make a great observation. I mean, it's kind of like the saying that people get the government they deserve. And there are a lot of people who are just tuned out to government and politics and don't take any interest in it. And, you know, I mean, even though Twitter is 140 or 240 characters, it can link to longer, more meaningful forms of journalism. So I think there is value. But, you know, not everyone is going to avail themselves of it. How do you get more people interested in politics? That's a tough thing. I mean, I think you make a great point. We are in an age where people's attention spans are getting shorter, and it's relatively few people who take an interest in civics and politics. But what does our panel say about that?
Yeah, it's just, it's taking the time, and I think people just don't put that time anymore into reading the news. You're absolutely right, Joe, that people just figure out, this is the news outlet that I'm going to get my news from. I don't care if it's right or wrong, this is where I'm going to get it. Instead of taking the time to read multiple newspapers, watch multiple broadcast news, go to multiple websites to filter the news through and figure out and be skeptical and cynical and figure out what exactly is true. I know I'm very old-fashioned. I prefer the traditional media because reporters like you, Ian, you check your sources. You don't go with the story unless you check 2, 3 people to make sure it's absolutely true. There are too many news sites out there that just put something up quickly just to get it out there, and if a grain of it's true, grain and the rest of it's false, hey, so what? Move on to the next story.
And can I say something? I think you're in a really, really good position. Where did he go? Oh, as the head of your Republican chapter, and if I can kind of merge that with what Dylan was saying, right? Devin was saying, all politics is local, right? And so this idea of reading and getting invested in your local community is really what we see leads to long-standing political engagement. So if your chapter, for example, right, you're going to have a reading club, right? So every week you read the newspaper, the stories, Once you start following these stories and getting invested in these causes, and not only that, participating in civic discourse so that something changes, that changes people. And that makes it so that when they read something, they not only come with knowledge that makes them be able to see, oh, wait a second, this isn't true, and be able to skip it, or say there needs to be more, information on this. So I think you're in a really good position here to really foment that. And if I could just say one thing, when I was finished with the 2012 campaign, I really had to do like a drastic change of how I read the media, right? Because the only thing you care about in politics is the headline, right? So I realized that as I was reading, first of all, I was reading all the newspapers, of course, because I was only reading the headline in the lead paragraph, and I would never get to the second one. So it's so easy. It's just as, it's a hard habit to break, but obviously one that's worth it.
And I think some good has come of it, and what Mike said, I mean, when you think about it, some people who may have been considered, if Devin was, running a campaign and looking at the low information, mid-information, high-information voters, I think people are becoming more involved. Liberal, conservative, pro-Trump, anti-Trump, conservatives who don't like Trump, never Trumpers, you name it. I mean, however you look at Trump, you're paying more attention now. And it's time-consuming, though. It's so time-consuming, as you all know, when you try to source stories and do whatever. Try practicing law and doing that, and it's hard. Yeah. It's hard.
Let's go to another question.
Tim Bellivo, busboy. I'd like to thank you all for being here tonight, first of all. And I do believe the Trump administration deserves some credit for the economic growth. However, do you feel like it's come at a really irresponsible sacrifice of environmentalism and international relations?
Yes.
Yeah.
I'm not sure. I didn't hear that last part. Could you speak a little closer to the mic?
Do you believe the growth has come at an irresponsible sacrifice of environmentalism and international relations?
Oh, okay. I'll say yes again if you like.
I
think to some degree, Tim, there's truth in that. There's some unpacking that I think Joe would want to do if he had more time about whether the economy is the same thing as the stock market. Mm-hmm. They're not, and certainly the stock market's going gangbusters.
There's an 18-month lag between the entrance of a president and the effect of any presidential initiatives.
Yeah, this is
on the
Obama.
economy.
This is still
about in
Obama
18
job
months.
creation.
So whatever that is,
for whatever that is,
go
to the Fed
whatever
data,
that's worth.
Federal Reserve data.
It's truth, but whatever that is. But I do think you bring up. We've talked about the changes that are happening in environmental permitting, for example, which is something I care a great deal about. I'm going to go and practice environmental law when I'm done in law school. And some of the things that are coming out of the Pruitt-led EPA are I think, really damaging and challenging. But the problem is that all of these things have lag times. And we're not going to know the impact that these changes in regulatory regimes are going to have over time. We'll never know what the Clean Power Plan was going to do for asthma, for child mortality, for all sorts of things, because it's been scrapped before it had life. So there's a degree to which some of this was prospective, and those things have changed. But I took enough Joe lectures to know that some of these things have lag time and lead time, and we have to keep that in mind as well.
One of the interesting things we're seeing is that the United States has had a reckoning in terms of its position in the world probably for about 20 years. And the strategy of both Republicans and Democrats in the White House has been to kind of bring us in for a long-term soft landing where we're no longer the dominant power. But we're going to do that, ease into that. We're going to still be the preeminent power. We're still going to assert ourselves. But we're going to come in for a soft landing. I think what we're seeing with this administration is they're different. And I think the original point that people elected him because he's different. Well, guess what? This administration took the controls of the plane and pointed downward on foreign policy. And so that reckoning's just coming a little earlier, that our role in the world is being diminished, and it will continue to be.
Yes, sir.
Jim Keating, I'm on the faculty here. I couldn't help but think during this, what if Hillary had won? No. Excuse me. If Hillary had won and we were here, would RINPR have had the same panel? Would they had three partisans, against Hillary Clinton and then two defenders? Would every question have been skewed negatively as it was tonight? So as much as I appreciate you coming here, you may not see it, sir, but often people don't see their own biases. That's the reason you talk to other people who have different views. But let me ask this question. The notion that Donald Trump is attacking the media and calling it fake news, that's not new. For one thing,
Sir, do you have a question?
Yeah.
Please get to it.
Yeah. Really?
I think he did. I think it's a question, what would this panel have looked like if Hillary was president?
Let me formulate my own question.
I thought you did. I thought you asked, would this panel look the same if Hillary was president? I'm sorry, Jim. I didn't mean to. Go ahead.
It's difficult to answer.
I know you're offended, sir, but I'm going to make my statement anyway. But it will be in the form of a question. Are you actually expecting us to forget, not you, but the entire panel, that the attacks upon Mueller are no different than the attacks upon Ken Starr, right? No different at all. The attacks upon CNN are no different by Donald Trump, no different from Barack Obama's attack on Fox News, his attempt to take Fox News. We could argue.
Sir, are you going to get to the question?
I agree with the first one. I disagree with the second.
Yeah. Well, then here's my question. Explain to me the difference between Barack Obama's attack upon Fox News and Donald Trump's attack upon CNN. What's the difference?
I don't see the Fox News and CNN as being counterparts ideologically.
Yeah.
What?
You wouldn't either.
You don't think CNN is liberal where Fox is conservative? Really?
No.
I think Fox News is much more ideological.
Yeah.
Okay, you've proven my point. Thank you.
I think the paradigm is Fox News and MSNBC, actually.
Yeah, right.
Exactly.
That's a good comparison.
Any day.
Exactly.
Yeah. I mean, CNN is just irrelevant as far as I'm concerned. They just need to go. Clinton News Network. But I do think that MSNBC and Fox, my wife yells at me when I have MSNBC on, but I do want to see what Rachel Maddow has to say. It's hard to listen to, but I do want to see. And then I also want to hear what Sean Hannity has to say. And then I watch network news like Lisa does.
And I beg you to stop doing all three.
And it's hard. It's hard to do all three.
And if your argument, the difference is, well, Fox deserves it and CNN doesn't.
Well, let me try, Jim. I think the difference between Obama's complaints, which, by the way, I thought were essentially rank amateur complaints. You know, you become the president, you're basically the guy who they're gonna hit on, particularly if it's an ideological source. But he never attacked their fundamental decency, their fundamental motives. He only attacked them as being ideological and a knee-jerk critic of him. Donald Trump is trying to denigrate the very people who are doing the job that they're doing, and he's attacking on a personal level in a way that Barack Obama didn't necessarily do. And you know, I do think there's a qualitative difference, but I also want to say, I'm on record saying that Barack Obama should never have become president because he suffered from the same problem that our current president suffers from, and that is amateurs have no business having the White House as their office. And Barack Obama did not have enough experience to be president. That was part of his problem as president. Donald Trump has the same problem.
Let's go to another question.
Hi, good evening. I'm Corey. I'm a graduate student here. This is a question primarily for the liberals on the panel. Yeah, I'll just say it. The gentleman on the end there, you had alluded to the fact that in our culture, in our society, we have a deep sickness. If there is a deep sickness, and I'm likely to agree with you that there is, we probably would disagree as to what the symptoms are, but one of them has to be the fact that we're able on both sides to mitigate between what outrages us and what doesn't outrage us. And we're both guilty of this, but right now it just seems that since there's a Republican in the White House, the liberals get away with, you know, playing the I'm more outraged than you game. For example, Miss, you in the middle there, I mean, your outrage, I'm sorry, I interpret it as being rather phony because you're outraged by the fact, for example, that the president uses filthy language. Were you,
Not filthy language.
Let me finish. Come on, using shithole is filthy language. All right, listen, but please. So when Barack Obama, though, for example, if we're talking about right and wrong, when he was carrying out drone strikes and killing people in Pakistan, most of whom were not terrorists, okay, and likewise his foreign policy was not as dovish as people want to think it was. Were you as outraged then, and what's worse,
Yes.
using bad language or killing human
Yes.
beings? I mean, I'm a little
I'm on the record as
confused
criticizing
here.
Barack Obama on the things that I didn't agree with him on. I'm an equal opportunity criticizer, and when I see something that I don't like, I say it. I think that what President Trump,
on the
whether
internet,
it's...
would you be able to point us in the direction of your work on the internet where you've condemned?
You can Google my name and find all the
Were
quotes.
you as equally condemned, for example, even though I'm sure you make use of the Hitler tropes when criticizing Donald Trump, were you also equally as critical when Barack Obama signed the National Defense Authorization Act into law, criminalizing every single U.S. citizen? Were you as outraged then? Were you, sir, as outraged then? Were you using Hitler tropes then for Barack Obama? You guys wonder why you lost. You keep on playing this game. You're going to lose again.
It's unfortunate it's unfortunate that the nature of this conversation made it so that you appeared to know a lot about me and how I criticize folks.
That's why I'm asking you. Can you point me in the right direction of your work?
I think, look, we all come, you know, at this from completely, you know, different angles and with different life experiences. I come from 20 years as a human and civil rights activist, and this president, somebody said, as you said, that, you know, people follow just one issue. I follow immigration, right? That's my thing. And this president has been so offensive on so many levels. At the same time, I was highly criticized when, after being President Barack Obama's spokesperson, I confronted, and I'm on the record as criticizing him for deporting more people than anybody else before.
I'm not asking you to criticize him on Barack Obama's immigration
I appreciate that you think that this is biased, but I would welcome you kind of, you know, looking a little bit more into the stuff that I said before you formulate opinions.
Well,
Thank you.
I'd be happy for you to point us in the direction.
Sure, you have my name. It would be great.
Well, we'll look for it. But
great.
Sir, let's go to. We've got a couple of people behind you.
Let me just ask one more question, please. The problem here is that liberals, again, are being selective in their outrage. And you're using the same language that you used a year ago and 2 years ago to demonize and demagogue your opponents. You're not having debates on ideas. You're calling conservatives racist. You can't call Donald Trump a racist without, by implication, calling all those who support him racist and homophobes and xenophobes and Islamophobes.
I think it's uncomfortable to sit with that reality that I think a lot of people and a lot of Republicans that I've spoken to across the country didn't really think that he was going to follow through with a lot of the things he said. They're like, oh, he's just a street
So let's
fighter.
try
But
and
now we're
experiment
seeing,
in what you're
right?
asking. Could you give me one thing that Donald Trump has done that really deeply offends you? And can you give me one thing that Barack
Yes,
Obama
I
did
could.
that you admire?
About Barack Obama?
Yes.
I think the Iran deal actually wasn't that bad.
I'm sorry, what?
I think the Iran deal actually wasn't quite as bad as his
Okay.
opposition said
Thank
it
you.
was.
That's great.
Okay. Donald Trump, I'm disappointed in his foreign policy because it's really no different from Barack Obama. The problem is it's just a timetable difference. Barack Obama wants to use drones, Donald Trump wants to use bad language, but it's really the same thing. I mean, you guys are picking apples and oranges out of here.
Sir, you've made your point. Can we get a question from someone else?
Appreciate it. Thanks.
Hi, my name is Michael Broder, and I'm a clinical psychologist. And as part of my job, it's really important to have healthy dialogue. And to go to Ian's question earlier about what's going to help us move forward with polarization, but we have to do a combination of not only actively listening to each other, but also critical reflection. So this is a question for all of the panel. I'm wondering, actually, as the panel discussion ends later, what's one thing that you heard tonight that shifted you, moves you, something that you'll critically reflect on that might have come from somebody that you might disagree with?
Well, I would say that I actually agree a lot with what Brendan said with regard to the meaning of elections and the reality of somebody wins something, they get to do things, whether or not people before play by the rules. And so I think that there's lots of consensus that we weren't able to sort of go back and forth on. But I do think that Donald Trump is not all that different, except for his quirky personality, than presidents before him. And I think the American people are paying attention now, and I think that's a good thing.
I'm inclined to agree and to think, and I've been thinking a lot about this, and so it was good to hear it mentioned here and to remind myself to think about this. I am not, the question of legitimacy was thrown around earlier, and I am not someone who believes the president is illegitimate. I believe in the integrity of our elections. I don't think, while I do think there was international intrigue involved in our election, I don't think it changed the result of the election. And so one of the things that I should think about as someone who disagrees with the policies of the president is that the president won. And what does that mean? What does the country want? What does it mean that the country elected President Trump? And to what degree do we need to engage with whatever it was that the majority of the country wanted out of him? And so I think that's a good reminder of this conversation and why these kinds of conversations are important. Yeah. Instead of shouting at one another, we're trying to think and listen. And so I think that's a good reminder that kind of healthy engagement is really what we should be doing rather than shouting at one another.
And one of the things Gabrielle said earlier about me, which I appreciated because it's true, is that I am very optimistic. The glass is half full, but not just about Donald Trump, just about the direction of the country. And so I think, and something that Devin said made me think a bit. I was thinking today, walking in here, about how I wanted to talk about when we did a pro-Trump march about his 100th day or so at the State House. And the resist movement came with trombones and drums, and we couldn't hear ourselves speak. And that could have gotten really ugly, could have gotten dangerous. I thought it was very disrespectful that they couldn't just keep a little bit of distance and allow us to hear ourselves speak. And myself and the National Committee woman, Leanne Senek, was there and had a lot of words to say, and I thought that was really bad. But what Devin said about, don't underestimate the organization, don't underestimate what people are doing, the ladies group, the women's groups, the groups that are getting together and trying to find quality candidates, I get it. I mean, they can win elections with quality candidates, and I can learn from that as well. So,
It's always fascinating to hear how people get at their political views. And after Trump won, I did a story on Johnston, traditionally a Democratic town, and how it had the biggest flip of any city or town in Rhode Island for Trump. And I went and I talked to people at coffee shops, talked to the local Democratic and Republican town chairman. And that, I think you're right. It's important to listen. I feel my job as a reporter is to listen. And so it's interesting to hear some of the viewpoints being expressed here.
And I listened to that story, and I recommend you go to the archive. Really, it was terrific.
Thank you.
You just reposted it. That was good.
Yeah. Just out of curiosity, just a quick follow-up, actually, just to be more specific. Just especially since we're going to be hearing things from different points of view that might confirm or maybe challenge what we already feel. I'm curious to know specifically both. This is a question for both Gabriela and for Brandon. What's one thing you heard from each other that specifically related to tonight that you're going to take away? That will maybe kind of lead you to kind of think about things maybe from a little different angle than when you came in tonight?
My personality and the way that I speak is such that I'm an animated person, right? And so I'm new to New England. If to New England, it's a little, I can understand how this can be seen as anger or whatever. It's not the case. I think I don't take criticism against my president, in let's say in Barack Obama as a personal thing. I think it's separate from me. I can debate the policy things. One thing that I'm looking forward to is to talk to more Rhode Islanders about the immigrant experience in this country, about why it is that I get so animated when I start talking about comments like this. I think it's something that for very, very long, and what I'm finding more and more, many, many Americans, including in New England, have kept it here and haven't really tapped into remember that we're all from there. I think that there's a lot in common that we can find as far as why we love this country. So yeah, I look forward to more dialogues, and I appreciated hearing the news habits of folks. I appreciate the context of, okay, so maybe the world isn't going to end, because sometimes, all my friends are, depressed. They're thinking they're going to be deported tomorrow. I cry, almost every day because of this, and I look forward to sharing those perspectives with folks that are willing to learn and hear them.
There's a sociologist, Arlie Hochschild, has written a book called Strangers in Their Own Land, looking at Tea Party Republicans and trying to understand them from a different perspective. She used the term empathy wall. And she said basically what's happened was, because we've turned politics into some sort of bizarre business where people make money by getting us agitated with each other, the empathy wall has gotten so tall, no one climbs over it anymore. And I think she basically said, the empathy wall isn't anywhere near as high as we think, and we need to start looking for ways to go over that wall and to understand the other. And I think a lot of us are trying to do that these days.
Okay, another question.
My name is Steve Duryea. I'm a 82 alum, PC parent, and I'm on staff right now. I'm going to lighten this up a little bit. Dr. Cammarano mentioned amateurs becoming president. Dianne Feinstein is 84. Pelosi is 78. The guy that was in his underwear in Michigan was 89. Term limits. The Constitution, you go back 200 years, people went to Washington for a couple of years, 4 years, 6 years, and they went home. I think if we got back to that, maybe we would have a better government.
Yeah.
Are term limits the answer?
Real quick, I have the grand bargain that I've had for 10 years. I hate term limits, but I'll trade them for a constitutional amendment saying money and free speech are not the same thing. Buckley versus Vallejo, 1976. That combined with sort of the careerism and the professionalism and the sidelining of the rest of us in politics are the two biggest problems that we have.
I agree. Money and elections, I agree.
And I tend to agree as well. Term limits, I don't like term limits. We have term limits, they're called elections.
But why should it be a career? It was never meant to be a career.
I don't think that's true. I don't think that's true. There are certainly examples, particularly executive examples, right? President Washington set for us an example of 2 terms in executive office, and we saw that at state levels initially too. But there are plenty of historical examples of legislators who spent careers making laws. I don't call a lawyer to fix my plumbing. We'd be very bad at it, I imagine. But I in fact want and encourage people to give their lives to public service. I think that there's a lot right with people who choose a life of serving others. There's a book that Professor Cammarano uses in his classes that's about state legislators that was done by 2 political scientists in Vermont. I'm trying to remember what the name of it is.
Grant Reeder's book.
Yeah, Reeder's book. And it's
Learning to Legislate, I think.
Yeah, that's right. And it stuck with me. I read that as a freshman in college here in 2005, and I still think about that book because the stories of those citizen legislators, we're going to have bed eggs, but there are people who every day were getting up and going and serving their constituents, and it gets harder in Congress. I think when you're serving almost 500,000 people, it's harder. It's harder to know exactly what your constituents want and how to lead. I think that's more challenging. But I do really believe that particularly legislators, it's different with executives, but I think legislators, I think it's actually more about the citizens they represent and sometimes our apathy than it is about their behavior. Because we have a chance every 2 years or every 6 years to send them home if they're not serving us. And we need people who are willing to run in elections, which is not easy. Putting your name on a ballot is a very challenging thing to do. But also, I think, engaging with elected officials. I mean, the story of marriage equality in the state of Rhode Island, which I was a part of right after I graduated, was about citizen engagement with legislators on Smith Hill. It wouldn't have happened without people going and having conversation with their legislators. And I learned that in Joe Cammarano's class here at Providence College. And I think that I have faith. I have talked about optimism. I have optimism, but it's going to take a recommitment of citizens to engage with their elected officials.
All right, well, thanks very much for coming out tonight.